Moin Whisky-Fans, hier ist Leon von den Malt Mariners in Neuseeland bei der Thomson Distillery und ich habe hier Matt sitzen, den Head Distiller der Brennerei, und wir werden uns gleich ein bisschen unterhalten. Wir werden natürlich das Interview auf Englisch machen. Ihr könnt gerne die Untertitel verwenden, die automatisierten Untertitel von YouTube, die sind normalerweise ganz gut, zumindest wenn es vom Englischen ins Deutsche geht. Okay, we're switching back to English. Matt, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
As you can hear, I'm still battling a bit with a cold. The last week was not really that much holiday or fun that I expected, but now I'm getting better and I'm here at your distillery in New Zealand. And I'm really curious to talk about you and your whiskey and your brand and New Zealand whiskey, or New Zealandish whiskey. How do you say that? Like, would you say New Zealandish whiskey as probably the way to say it, right?
Oh, well, New Zealand whiskey because it's made here.
Yeah, okay. Because, you know, New Zealand is not really a country that people would think of when they hear the word whiskey. And in Germany, for example, Australian whiskey has become a thing. Like distilleries like Starward, for example, have risen to be a prominent brand that people recognize for the exotic kind of part of whiskey. But New Zealand had, as far as I know, a bit of a tricky history with whiskey itself, but it's sort of starting to come along, isn't it? I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts and maybe give us a bit of a brief idea of what New Zealand whiskey, where it's coming from.
Sure. So the history of New Zealand whiskey is actually significantly older than Australia, although they're quite far ahead of us at this point in time.
Yeah.
So there were two distilleries that started in New Zealand that were reasonable scale. However, I don't know the actual capacity. In the 1890s, and what happened was a bit of an unfortunate story. Back in the old colonial days, you've got Britain, which is the workshop of the world, and you've got cotton goes to Britain, it goes to Manchester, gets turned into cloth and then exported. You've got raw materials go to Britain, get manipulated and then exported. And they noticed that New Zealand would be a good place to make whiskey and could potentially compete with, Ireland was part of the UK then, but could compete with Scotch and Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey actually would have been the biggest whiskey in the world in the 1890s. And it was a Scottish bank that lent us the money for our railroads, and they put a law in place that New Zealand couldn't produce whiskey. So it wasn't until something like 1967 or something like that that the ban shifted. And the two distilleries from the 1890s closed down. And then when the ban lifted, Wilson's in Dunedin, South Island of New Zealand, started a whiskey distillery, mainly making blended whiskey. Now, unfortunately, back then New Zealand wasn't known for high quality produce. Now we're known for good wine, good beer, and good, I don't know, lamb and things, you know. But back then, people didn't really back themselves, and so you could always get probably imported Scotch cheaper, and people rated Scotch as better, and this being as an imitation of Scotch, and never really reached a good price point. And then in the 80s, Seagram's of Canada bought Wilson's and started producing a single malt whiskey called Lammerlaw. This was actually in 1981, I believe.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and then they sold off their international interests in the early 90s, let's say 91, 92, and Foster's of Australia bought Seagram's New Zealand, which meant that they acquired a distillery without wanting it. And so they shut it down and sold off the stock. They were purchasing Seagram's New Zealand for whatever else they had. And so then what happened, I guess the stock sort of hung around for a while, and a guy from Mills Reef Winery in the central North Island purchased the remaining Wilson stock and Lamelore stock, and he started a brand called Milford Whisky, and he set up his barrel store in Oamaru in the South Island, and he was planning on starting a big whiskey distillery. And it was at that point, I'd been home distilling for years and going to whiskey tastings and was really interested in whiskey. And at that point, the only whiskey on the shelf would have been some of the remainder of Wilson's branded and some of his Milford, which would be sort of single cask whiskey. I approached him to see if I could buy some casks, and it took about 6 months of him not returning my emails or calls, and then eventually he said yes, and that was the start of us, and it's a brief history of New Zealand whiskey.
Wow, that's perfect. So first of all, could you repeat the name of the whiskey? Because I've seen it from this New Zealand whiskey company. I never had any idea how to pronounce it, and you just said it, and you pronounced it obviously probably correct.
Well, I pronounce it how I would pronounce it, which I would say Oamaru.
Oamaru.
Okay. But so as the sort of story progresses, so what had happened was from home distilling and things, had sort of concluded starting a distillery was out of my reach. It was going to be too hard to do, but it would be a nice fun thing to do, to purchase some casks of whiskey. And the idea kind of was just that there was no whiskey that you could be proud of in New Zealand. I didn't particularly like the Milford brand, but I knew they had some good whiskey. And I just thought, you know, if you're in Ireland, if you're in Canada, or if you're in Kentucky, you know, you can go and buy some local whiskey if someone's here from out of town. Try this, you know. And I just felt like we didn't really have that, and I wanted there to be a good New Zealand whiskey. So we went down to Oamaru and went through, say, 50 casks, and then took samples back and got into a few key shops, and we couldn't get a consensus on what was a good cask. And then we went back again and went through another 30 casks or something like that. And then we had a consensus on like, this is the cask. And then we bottled it, and we bought a couple more. And then when I called the Milford Whisky again a few months later, because now I had a list of casks that we would want to buy, the phone went through to the receivers, and they only wanted to sell the entire stock or none at all, which for me, just starting out with a few barrels, was not really feasible. Plus our strike rate was only about 1 in 12 casks that we wanted to bottle. And so then Australian investors got together and purchased the entire stock. So that shut me off, because I had a couple of casks and a brand and what was looking like something where I could buy a new spirit if I'd started a distillery. That was now shut down. So then I went, right, well, I'm going to have to start a distillery. And I started looking at New World whiskies, and Stauning Whisky and Balcones in the States. Those were the two that I thought were doing cool stuff.
Balcones? Can you repeat the ones that you looked into?
Stauning and Balcones.
Stauning in Denmark. Okay, interesting. Okay, so Stauning and Balcones were the two distilleries you were looking into. I mean, I love Balcones all over the place. It's one of my absolute favorite American distilleries.
It's cool, eh? What I love as a small distillery is they mess around with stuff and do a whole lot of cool releases. So that's what I like. And I love the American whiskies. A lot of people sort of in New Zealand go, oh, single malt is king. And almost single malt means good, but I love messing around with the mash bill and stuff. And I do really love that fresh American oak, heavy charred American oak as well.
Okay.
So yeah, so Stoning looked like they were doing good jobs, getting really good reviews, and I say balconies, but I don't know if it's balcones or balconies.
I don't know either. I always say balcones or yeah.
It reads like that, but someone told me it was balconies, so I don't know. But great whiskey though.
Exactly. That's all that matters.
Yeah. And so anyway, I noticed they had modified the stills, and so I essentially bought the same still that they had.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll show you a picture of the still.
Yeah, from Holger in Portugal.
Yeah. And
I brought it here, and then I put a bigger column on it, and I used to study sculpture, and I used to build props and film sets.
What did you study?
I studied sculpture and design. But
sculpture, okay, sculpture. I didn't understand it. Yeah.
But because of, you know, if you're building props and film sets, then you have a lot of new challenges all the time.
Yeah.
So I quite like those challenges, and so we're, you know, beating out a copper elbow for the top of the column going into the line arm and things.
Yeah. I
quite enjoy doing that, actually.
Cool.
So that was also the good thing actually about buying one of those stills, because they're quite a bit cheaper, obviously, than a Scottish still. But that means that you don't need to be too precious about them, so that you can adjust them. And I put a cooling coil inside the column. I can show you that.
Cooling coil?
Yeah.
Inside the column. Okay.
So you've got the column, and then I've got half-inch copper tube goes in and goes around and then comes out. And you've got cold water that comes in, goes around and goes out. And you can use that to extend the middle cut.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's just quite good because it's sort of a key point in the middle cut that's really good. So you kind of want to hold that. So you might turn down the still and put the cooling on.
Yeah. Go.
Okay, so this still here, this was a 900 litre basically brandy still that got in from Portugal, and I cut the onion dome and put this bigger column on and built that elbow there. It's a worm condenser, and it's direct fired, so it's a very traditional setup.
Cool.
And then the wash still over here, this is just under 2,000 litres, like 1950 litres. We normally run it at 1,600 litres though. This is all copper. I've just put this stainless insulation jacket on. You can see there's the outlet down there. And this is direct fired as well. This is direct fired with a large paella burner. There's a nice even flame. The shape here is partly to fit in the room with a line arm that runs up. The line arm is really great, and I would do this in the future because you can get a balance between refluxing and coming over into the condenser. You can get it just at the point where nothing's coming over and it's all running back. So I would definitely do this for a spirit still in the future, and they're both worm tub condensers. Why the column is shaped like this is I didn't know if I'd need to put a rummager inside because it's direct fired, and so having the flat top like that meant that I could put the mechanics for a rummager to run down.
Yeah, can you just quickly explain what a rummager is, because I'm not sure if everybody knows that.
Yeah, so a rummager is basically some chainmail cloth. I think it's normally in 3 pieces, might be in 4, that runs across the bottom of the still, and it slowly turns, and it stops yeast and things from sticking and burning to the bottom of the still. You potentially need those in stills that are direct fired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, before it's super interesting, but very nerdy.
Yeah.
Before we get into the nerdy details, just to let me sum up what I understood so far. So you came from being an independent bottler, basically.
Yeah.
You bought cask from the Dunedin, another word learned, distillery, and then you couldn't get any more of these casks, and you started the distillery, basically.
Yeah.
And your whiskey is single malt. Does that mean, or do you, because you said you play around with the mash bills, do you make different whiskies or do you only make single malt?
No, we do a rye whiskey.
Ooh!
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to try that one. I really hope I can get that in Germany, because I'm a big rye fan.
Oh, right, no, you can't actually. We don't. There's only about 200 bottles left of the current rye.
Okay.
And
I need to bend you around then later to get.
So we'll see if we've got a bottle for you to try. I love the rye.
Yeah.
The problem with the rye, it's all malted rye. It's malted rye and malted barley.
Yeah. Awesome.
Malted rye costs significantly more than malted barley, and it's a lower yield, and it's harder to work with. It sticks the mash. Yeah. Plus, if it doesn't say single malt whiskey, people don't want to pay as much for it. So it's got all those things against it, but flavour-wise, I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean I can imagine. I mean, I heard so many people, so many distillers complaining about how much rye whiskey is such a pain in the ass. Excuse my French, to get it going.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting. So, how is, like, law-wise in the EU, for example, in Europe, a whiskey has to be at least 3 years old before it can be called whiskey. If it's a single malt, it has to be from 100% malted barley. Do you have any sort of regulations about whiskey in New Zealand, or is it like 100% Wild West? You can do whatever you like, or?
Well, it's both actually.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So I noticed Thomson whiskey is kind of the first of the new distilleries, because there's now maybe 7 distilleries doing whiskey in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But we were slightly before them. Padrona might have started distilling a year later than us, and maybe Waiheke would. But anyway, we're probably the first with whiskey on the shelves. Definitely because we were the independent bottlers. It's not my point. My point is that the definition of New Zealand whiskey by law has to be at least 37% ABV and have the characteristics normally associated with whiskey.
37. Okay, that's
well. 37 is the threshold for spirits. So whiskey is a spirit, so therefore it has to be 37%. Below that, you can't call it a spirit, and there's an exemption for tequila, because some tequilas are 35%.
That is very interesting, because that would make you, as far as I'm aware of, that would make New Zealand whiskey the only whiskey in the world that could be below 40% and still be legally called whiskey. Because all other countries I know have a 40% threshold, like States and Europe.
Well, we do get bourbon whiskey that's bottled here at 37%.
Really?
And I suspect if it was in the States, it would need to be 40%. So anyway, that's a very loose definition, because it doesn't say that it needs to be made from grain.
Okay.
It doesn't say that it needs to be in a cask. So in theory, you could get some spirit made from sugarcane,
you can
add some flavouring, and go, it's 37%, it's got the characteristics associated with whiskey, here's my whiskey.
Yeah.
So that sort of was a major threat, and so what I did was I went to another distiller, Pocono Whiskey, who also got interest in Scotland and France, and said, this, you guys are starting out, and this I see as a big problem here, because no matter where you go, there's some shysters that want to get money for doing the minimum, and
absolutely
there's a potential to kind of ruin the industry before it gets going. And so I wrote down what I thought the rules should be and proposed it to Matt Johns of Pocono, because he had more experience, because associated with the Scottish distillery as well.
I'll actually meet him day after tomorrow, so we'll do.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, that's great. That's quite. Yeah, it's a really good distillery down there. He does a great job. He's been really helpful. To propose, well, this is what I think, and we debated it out, and then we called other distillers and got them on board, and then we all debated it out, and now we've got the New Zealand Whiskey rules as set by the New Zealand Whiskey Association.
Cool.
Which are not binding by law, but they're a code of conduct for us, and if you were going to start a whiskey distillery, then you would be wise to look at the rules, because I think they will go into law.
Yeah.
The biggest problem was that it's quite cheap to get a stainless steel tank and put an element in it and turn that into a still. So long as you're using malted barley, then you could call that single malt whiskey.
Yeah.
However, there's two things that you're buying when you're buying single malt whiskey. You're buying a sort of flavour profile that isn't normally associated with single malt whiskey, and you're buying a traditional process. You would expect it to have come from this traditional process.
Yeah.
And that was the biggest one of pushback, me saying single malt whiskey needs to be made in copper pot stills. And a lot of people, or a number of annoying vocal people, were saying, well, I want to use stainless steel as part of my creativity, or the price of copper is too expensive. And I'd be like, well, you're starting a single malt whiskey distillery, like, don't be going crying poor, you know.
Yeah.
It's quite a big undertaking, you know, like the difference between the price of stainless and copper, like,
yes.
That's negligible, you know. So we got that. Back to the definition, malted barley is the highest yield and is the cheapest malt. It would be more expensive for me to, I don't even know if I can buy malted corn in New Zealand, but so I probably have to malt it myself. But I can buy malted rye. Maybe we can buy malted oats. Every other one is lower yield and is more expensive. So as with the rye and barley that we made, I didn't call that single malt, but it actually costs us more to make than the single malt whiskey.
Okay.
So I felt like you should be able to say single malt whiskey if it's all malt. So if it's all malted rye, or if it's malted rye, malted barley,
yeah,
that's still single malt because it's all malt and it's from one distillery.
Yeah. But
in the wording we said, so if you're using any grains other than barley, you have to specify what they are. So my single malt rye, I can say single malt rye and barley.
Yeah.
And if I want, put the proportions on the back.
So is there any other like labeling? I mean, like Scotland says we only have single malt and grain whiskey and blended whiskey. America says we have like all the grains like bourbon, rye, malt. So you talk about single malt, you talk about rye. Is there any other specific like type of whiskey, like blended whiskey probably? Do you have something like grain whiskey as well? Or?
Well, no, the issue there is we don't have any big distilleries producing grain whiskey.
Okay.
So those things are a little bit, those... Maybe we should, we'll just cut for that noise at the back.
Oh, that's fine, yeah.
Yeah, we don't have any big grain distilleries, so the cheaper grain whiskey isn't relevant here. It's a bit more like American mash bills. Like if you choose a different grain,
yeah,
that's because you want those profiles, not because it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Are you going down to Ord Distillery in the South Island?
Probably not. I might be staying in the North Island, but
yeah,
we'll see.
That one. For anyone watching this, AULD, Ord Distillery in South Island. That's a great one to watch because he's got that's on site at a grain farm, and he grows different heritage grains. So that's super exciting. Yeah.
So maybe you want to walk me through your current range, and maybe do you know what kind of whiskies are available in Germany right now from Thomson?
I would imagine our Manuka smoked single malt. So this one.
Just hold that up here.
This is what we're most famous for, and in New Zealand we do have peat, and we do a peated whiskey.
Awesome.
My palate's sort of mellowed a bit now, but when I first started getting into whiskey, I really loved smoky whiskies beyond anything else, and I wanted to make a New Zealand smoked whiskey. So back in the early 2000s, like 2004, 2005, when I was home distilling, I started getting malt from a homebrew shop and started smoking that, and I would smoke it on my Weber barbecue. I put some mesh across there and get a Manuka wood fire going, and wet the malt and put that over the top, put the lid on, and I started doing that. That was in concept, see, in Ireland and Scotland they might burn peat for fuel, but we never would in New Zealand because we've got lots of wood. So, and we would smoke, or we would cook over different woods for different flavours. Manuka is the most common.
Yeah.
And that it's a hardwood and it grows, it's part of the regeneration of the forest. So the trunks don't grow that big, they may be this big. So it's not really good for furniture or anything.
So Manuka is a type of wood and you use that for smoking the barley for that whiskey. So it's a wood smoked whiskey.
Yeah. Manuka honey is quite famous, so that's quite good because people overseas might know it. Interestingly, the New Zealand native honeybee doesn't produce honey. It lives in the ground and it just eats the nectar. So it wasn't until European honeybees came here that we had Manuka honey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I mean there was no whiskey pre-1890 here, I guess, so there was no Manuka whiskey either. Yeah.
It's an import story.
So this one, and this one's really good. I mean, people get like smoked bacon notes. Not really iodine, like peat, cinnamon, clove, sort of forest kind of notes. The difference in it, I don't know how old peat is, but thousands of years, say, you know how peat's sphagnum moss that is not decomposing but is building up over time. The Manuka wood might have been harvested 6 months, a year before it gets burnt, so it's full of resins and things. It's quite different. It's quite a resiny smoke, and a lot of that comes through in the distillate, which actually doesn't necessarily come across as smoky notes. It comes across as a kind of flavour. You'll go, oh, there's no smoke, but the difference between the smoked spirit and the knot is quite distinct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what kind of cask are you using? You said before you're a fan of virgin oak. Is that like oak from New Zealand, or is it expert like bourbon, like American oak? Or?
Yes, we mainly use ex-Jack Daniels casks. We use a lot of ex-wine casks. We've got going to pick up some casks this afternoon. Actually, we've got a winemaker within a few kilometres, and I can call him. He'll empty them on the day, and I can go and pick them up. So make sure nothing grows inside them. And I produced some small casks myself, which was really great to get going, because when you're using new flavors, putting it in a cask for 3 to 5 years to know whether it turns out well, it's good to put it in small casks so you can sort of work out your distillation process and what woods work and things like that.
Awesome. And what's all the other guys doing here? Like we have like is that limited editions or?
Yeah, so what we normally
especially this one is called Zeitgeist, which is a German word. So I was like, what
is that one? Normally we have one limited edition going out. So this way we've got a whole lot. Yeah. But this Manuka Smoke Full Noise is the only one that's actually for sale at the moment. Yeah. They're all sold out. And the Zeitgeist is unsmoked malted barley, double distilled, and then it was matured in an ex-Jack Daniels barrel for I think 3 years, and then it went into a Flounders Red Ale cask for a year.
So you are basically, obviously, holding up to the minimum 3 years range of your single malt?
If it was in the small, yes, now we are, yeah, totally. But initially it was quicker in the smaller casks. But now we are, I think we're, in the next few months we'll be able to maintain a standard 5-year-old release. Okay. Which is kind of the goal. The Angel's share here we're getting 5% per year.
Okay. I thought it might be much more because it's such a humid, warm climate. But
yeah.
5% is like almost Kentucky style, a bit more, but
yeah. So if you go, because it's like just under 2%, I think, average in Scotland. Yeah. So if you get to a 10-year-old New Zealand whiskey, we'll have lost more than double. Yeah. But with evaporation, but comes maturation. And if you're filling into first fill casks as well, if you've got 10, 12 years to make a whiskey, well, you can put it into second fill and third fill casks. Yeah, the virgin oak casks were ones that we made. I got American oak from the Appalachian Mountains and made 20-litre casks with that. We made maybe 120 of those, which were really great. Now we're just 2 kinds of casks now, which would be ex-Jack Daniels and New Zealand wine casks.
Cool.
There's something like 700 wineries in New Zealand, and I feel like that's normally with producing alcohol you use what's available.
Yeah.
So New Zealand wine would be made with New Zealand grapes. You know, we've got wine casks available, and they're really good quality. The wine casks that the winemaker that I use gets are all French oak, and the French oak ones are amazing because they're forest specific. So you know,
it must be. I mean, it must be so hard for you guys to get your hands on French oak because it's so far away, right? I mean,
well, no, it's the opposite actually.
Really?
Because the one, I think in Australia they might use a lot of American oak wine casks, but within the wineries that I know, they use 100% French oak.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And this, we might hot wash them and then fill straight into them if it's non-smoked. But smoky whiskey, I would STR them, which is shave, toast and char.
Yeah.
Which I really like that style of smoky whiskey in an STR cask. But I love the char in American oak, and if I was able to get American oak ex wine casks, then I would.
Yeah.
Almost they'd see them as inferior. Winemakers here would see them as inferior to French, but they could be better for whiskey.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of ex-bourbon casks in whiskey, especially if you want to really dive into the character of a new distillery, for example. I always prefer to have an ex-bourbon cask version of that whiskey. Nothing, over polished with any too much wine, too much SDR, too much port, anything like that, or sherry. Especially sherry, it can be a bit overpowering. But I love to have like a really good, clean ex-bourbon cask to try for if you access a new whiskey that you haven't tried before. That's my personal feel. I like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what I like as well. We were just at Brandfest, and it's a much more interest to me to see what's young and new, what's going on out there, and what's the quality, what's the character of that spirit.
To explain, Drumfest is a whiskey festival down in, where was it, Christchurch?
Christchurch, yeah. Which is a great whiskey festival. It's sadly it's only every second year. It's not every year, but if anyone is planning a trip to New Zealand, it'd be worth looking it up because it's a great festival.
Yeah, sounds awesome. You made me really, really curious, and I'm hating my blocked nose right now as much as I can imagine, because I would really love to try all these guys here. So yeah, I would say that's basically it for today for our interview. Matt, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you.
And explaining so much about your fantastic whiskey and your history of this very exciting country. And I think that I'm pretty sure we'll hear a lot about New Zealand whiskey in the future. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming by.
Ja, cheers.
Cheers, folks.
Bye.
Bye.
Ich sag mal, beziehungsweise, ich sag natürlich wie immer, bis später.
Is a really beautiful distillery and an amazing location.
Is that down there as well?
Yeah, so that's about might be a couple of hours drive from there. I bought a motorbike in Invercargill at the bottom of the South Island. It was an older tribe.
Oh man, that sounds good.
Yeah, it was good. And went to Ord, and then because he's on a farm. I'd only just bought the Triumph Pratt and wasn't very familiar with it. Yeah. And I just got off the stand. I turned the key to turn it off, and then had this 3-hour tour of the farm and the distillery and things. And when I came back, I realised to turn the light off, you need to flick a switch.
Shit.
Yeah, and it was completely dead. It was completely dead, and we tried to roll start it.
Oh no!
And the roads, the farm roads, are little pebbles. They're not
no chairs at all.
And so it's like going on marbles, trying to get down. I'm like, oh my god, I'm at the bottom of the South Island. What this bloody motorbike? It's not even working. And I've got to get home.
Yeah.
And anyway, we got it going. I had to ride up and down the road till the battery even had enough charge to give a spark.
Yeah.
I dropped the throttle. And then it sort of broke. Anyway, then I had to get to Cadrona for dinner. Like I was going to see them. I was meeting the owner for dinner at 7 o'clock, and so I just thought the bike. I really had to shoot up there. It was great.